Today, guys. Like Jonathan said, this is a little bit of a new webinar, just kind of going over basically how to increase profit in your practice. So the goal is, whether we got into being a private practice owner to make more money, or we got into it to kind of run our own business and have some freedoms, etc. Ultimately, we need to make sure that our practice is being profitable, whether we're a one-man show being the only PT, or we've got 6 or 7 or 10 or 14, however many staff and PTs we have. We've got to make sure that our practice is profitable. And so the things I'm going to talk to you about today really have no bearing on how big the practice is, etc., but really looking at making sure that we are running a profitable practice, especially in light of the fact that Medicare is talking about reducing the reimbursements by 9%. I know my practice is in Virginia, and we just got a notice from Blue Cross Blue Shield the other day that's effective retroactively back to October 1st. They're basically reducing our rates by about 12%. So, we're looking at anywhere on average of about a 10% reduction in what some of our big insurances are going to actually be reimbursing us for this year. And yet here we are, we're trying to not only manage COVID and the lost income that we had during that, but now we're going to turn around and in 2021 have a reduction in reimbursements as well. So unless we want to start all kinds of different side hustles, or we want to be selling our soul or doing all kinds of other things, we've really got to make sure that we're running a practice that's profitable. So I wanted to cover 3 main areas with you today. It's really making sure that your staff are productive and helping the practice to be profitable. Really going to set productivity standards and productivity levels for our staff. The second thing is really looking at where are some of the biggest areas that actually are kind of unseen or hidden, where our practices could be losing money. And then really look at the fact that making more money or being profitable isn't just about cutting expenses. It's really more about how do we manage things and having the right systems in place and being efficient and productive in what we do versus, well, let's just lay people off, right? One of the things that I used to, before I owned my own practice, I used to work for a large hospital system, and their answer to profitability was just cutting expenses, cutting staff, not buying supplies one week, whatever it might be. And that was how they, quote unquote, became more profitable. And that's not really what I want for you guys. So I wanted to just share some things that I found to be very successful in these 3 areas with you today, and cover from there. So the first thing I wanted you guys to really kind of think about is this concept that I've discovered as an owner. It's called staff think. And I'm not saying that I don't want my staff members to be able to think for themselves, but what I'm saying is I want them to think for themselves using a system or using a process that I want them to follow. Because if I've got a system that I know works, and when we follow it, we get reimbursed every penny we should be getting reimbursed, or we get the most out of every visit, or we don't have any cancellations, or we get great returns on our investment from a marketing and promotion standpoint, then I need to make sure that they're thinking, but they're thinking the way I would be thinking if I was sitting at that desk doing those activities, doing those actions. And so this concept of staff think, this term that I've kind of coined and come up with on my own, it basically means when they don't know what to do, because I think we would all agree we hire good staff, when they don't know what to do, they start doing what they think is best, which most times, unfortunately, isn't really going to be able to give us the outcome and the efficiency and the productivity that we really want. And therefore, that's going to start to have an effect on our profitability in the sense of it's taking more time to do something. It's not getting the full outcome. It's only getting a result 70% of the time, whatever it might be. And so the thing I want you to understand is that, again, I think we would all agree we hire good people, but when good people don't know what to do, they kind of make up what to do. And so we need to have systems and processes for them to follow. And that's part of what we're going to kind of look at today. And so, we could, I don't know if anybody's as old as me to remember the true original A team, but, we could look at, okay, who's our A team? And we'll just give them all of the things to do. But the problem is, if we only have 2 or 3 staff members, or if we have 20 or like me, 33 staff members, but not everybody's on the A team, I can't just dump all of the work on my A team all of the time. I have to have all of my staff on board and really producing and giving me the outcomes that it is that I'm looking for, which is kind of where something that I learned through Measurable Solutions in a course that I did called the Power Team Builder, basically what's called a scale of action. And so, we can rate it 1 to 10, or in terms of, a tone scale 0 to 4, or whatever it might be. But we want to have a way of rating our staff and not rating them in terms of, are they good staff or are they bad staff? But what is their actual action level? And more importantly, what is the outcome associated with their action level? And so, for example, a number 1 on this screen, a number 1 person versus a number 10 person, understand both of those employees are good employees. Both of them show up to work happy. Both of them get some things done over the course of the day. But the difference between a 1 and a 10, by the way, in this case, a 10 is actually not so good. They're a little bit more frazzled. They're a little more unorganized, etc. And a 1 is somebody that's very organized, gets a good outcome. Both of them are going to do things over the course of the day. Let's use as an example a front office person. Both of them are going to be able to answer the phone. And in a normal, good, everything, the patient isn't quote unquote difficult or anything. Both of them are going to be able to get the patient scheduled. But the difference is the number 1 employee on this scale of action, they're going to be able to handle that patient who's got some objections. I think I just need to come once a week. My kids are doing school from home right now, and I don't know who would watch them, etc. So how about we just do Fridays and we cancel the other 2 days? Well, the number 10 person on this scale, their scale of action is going to be very slow. They're not going to be able to really get that patient to understand the value of still coming 2 times a day, or the 2 other times a week. Help that patient to solve the problem of, okay, well, let's look at after school. What time does your husband get home? Oh, he gets home at 5 o'clock. Well, great. I have an appointment at 5:30 tomorrow. Let's change all of your Mondays and Wednesday appointments to 5:30. That's what that number 1 person on the scale of action is going to be able to do. And again, that's where my A team comes in. So a 1, 2, or 3 player is going to be a lot more of my A team. And an 8, 9, or 10 player, not that they're not on my team, but they're not going to be as contributory towards helping my practice to be profitable. Because as we'll look at when we look at something else here in a moment, that patient that calls up and says, I need to just decrease from 3 times a week to 1 time a week right now. Maybe next semester in January, when my kids are back in school all the time, I'll be able to come 3 times. That's a lost profit for our practice, and we're going to look at that. And so again, a 1, 2, or 3 player on the scale of action is somebody that's really going to be able to help us to really be productive. And I'm not saying that an 8, 9, or a 10 is a bad seed, a bad employee, but we have to understand that the bad seeds don't grow. And so if you're looking to grow your practice, and by grow, I don't mean all of a sudden turn into 7 clinics, et cetera. It could mean that to you. But if you're looking to grow your practice means grow it enough that at a minimum, you can withstand the 12% Blue Cross reduction in reimbursement. You can withstand the 9% Medicare cuts. You can withstand the fact that next year your staff are going to want raises. You can withstand the fact that next year the electricity is going to cost you more. A bad seed isn't going to grow. It isn't going to help your practice to grow. And so a staff member that's a bad seed, they come in, they sit at their desk, 7, 8, 9, 10, they get some things done, but they don't get a whole lot done. They're costing you the same amount, maybe a little bit more money, as the person that's a 1, 2, or a 3 who comes in and gets a lot of stuff done and is very efficient and very productive. And so that scale of action is really what helps us to determine, is this a good seed that's going to grow and help the practice to grow? Or is this a bad seed that, again, isn't a bad person, but is going to really cause difficulties for the organization to be profitable and be successful as we move along? And so, here's another example. Every patient that comes in for therapy should be replacing themselves before they're discharged. So I'm going to flip back a couple of slides. If I have a therapist who's a 1 or a 2, they're able to ask patients for referrals, follow up with people to find out who's somebody that can replace them. If I have somebody that is a therapist that's an 8, 9, or a 10, they're probably a very good therapist. They're very good at getting the patient better, but they're not good at filling that spot. And so again, what's going to help my practice to be profitable is if I don't have to put as much money into marketing and promoting, because my staff are marketing and promoting all the time by asking for referrals. Hearing a patient talk about their husband and then the fact that he woke up last night with pain in his neck and he didn't go to work today or whatever, if they recognize that that is a possible patient, now all of a sudden I got this new patient, but I didn't have to spend any money or any time or any effort to get the new patient because my staff members are doing it for me. So again, in my practice, we have a saying that basically says, every patient should replace themselves before they're discharged. And so we need to give our patients as much opportunity as possible to replace themselves. But again, the only way that that happens is if I have more people on my team that are my A team and more people that are 1, 2s, or 3s on this scale of action, more people that are higher toned and able to actually ask a patient for a referral. So for example, a patient walks into my clinic and says, you know, I'm feeling good today. I was able to take the dog for a walk last night. My clinicians have been trained, and even my front office have been trained, that there's a conversation that should be had with that patient at that moment. Typically, what happens as a clinician is we're like, oh, great, that's so good. Let's get started for the day. But what I've been able to teach my staff through, again, things that I learned from Measurable Solutions in the Power Team Builder course was that there should be a good 45 to 60-second conversation that occurs with the patient after that to help the patient to start to replace themselves. They may or may not know of somebody right now today, but if we have that conversation with them multiple times over the course of their remaining 4, 5, or 6 visits, all of a sudden, before we know it, we've got this flood of new patients that are coming in, and we're not having to spend any extra money in order to get that, helping our practice to be profitable. And so, you know, again, are your staff working to get referrals, or are they almost kind of indirectly turning that potential referral away by not even acknowledging the fact that this patient had a great result and may know somebody else that needs our help that could come to us, et cetera. So again, kind of thinking about that, you know, thinking with that, right? And so this is where we get into what I use the term targets. So a target is a detailed description of what I want my staff member to achieve. So if we go back to that slide about staff think, if I don't give them a target, I want you to have 3 patients this week that are able to refer somebody else. If I don't give them that target, then basically they set their own target, which is, oh, I gave out a bunch of referral cards. Well, referral cards don't get people to come in if they're not having the conversation with the patient on a regular basis that says, hey, this is how we could help somebody. Do you know anybody that we could help, et cetera, and having that conversation. So again, using that as an example, we set targets for our staff on pretty much everything all throughout the course of the week so that they know what's expected of them and what it is that we want them to achieve. So as an example, when I set a target of, I want you to ask 3 people this week if they know anybody else that we can help. By setting that target, I didn't necessarily just get the reply, you know, the outcome that I was looking for. They just ran out and started asking 3 people. What I had to do was give them what to say. And so I had to recognize that I needed to help them along the way a little bit, give them a little bit of training in order to do so. And so I'll give you, I'll talk about it a little bit more in a couple of minutes, but I'll give you one now. You know, so one of the things is that when a patient comes in and again says to the therapist, oh, you know, I was able to go for a walk with the dog last night. I've taught my therapist that what they say, regardless of what it is that that patient was able to do, I was able to blank last night or yesterday or this weekend or whatever. The reply is, that's great. Do you know anybody else that's having any problems that we could help as well? And I'm not necessarily looking for that staff member to get a name. Oh, Sally Sue, here's their phone number, et cetera. But I'm looking to plant that seed in the patient's mind that there is somebody. Now, in most cases, most patients will turn around and say, no, I don't know of anybody. And what happens is our staff members see that as a quote unquote failure. Oh, they didn't know anybody. They're not going to know anybody the next time or the time after that, et cetera. And so again, one of the things that we set up that we learned in this course is how do we continue to ask that same question when the patient is having good wins, et cetera? And then how do we practice that and drill that to kind of help our staff to feel more comfortable with it along the way? It's definitely not something that happened overnight. It took us a couple of weeks of putting in and training and working with our staff to get them to be able to ask that question. But that's just a repetitive question that they ask all the time, such that as the patient's been asked it 3 or 4 times, they'll actually start to go, I was able to take the dog for a walk last night, and I've been thinking about it. I might know somebody. Because again, we have to just keep putting that thought into their mind. But again, it starts by giving them targets. So I want you to ask 5 people this week if they know anybody that you can help. And just getting that out there and putting that out there starts to give them that thing to work towards. So this is an example to go a little bit further. How do we track what our staff are actually doing, right? If I go back to this, for any of you guys, if I go back to this scale of action, I know all these people are doing something, but some of them, 1, 2, and 3, are more efficient at how they're doing it. 8, 9, and 10 are less efficient. So I want to track how they're doing it. So every staff member for us, whether you are a tech or you work at the front desk or you're a PT or you're a biller or whatever, everybody has a stat sheet and they track what they're doing. Now, this is a PT's stat sheet. So their target for patient visits for the week is 65. We schedule patients every 30 minutes. So the green box up here is their actual outcome. We want patient visits. I want them seeing patients. That's how I'm profitable. But all of these things down in the gray area, all pretty much for a therapist, are all marketing and promoting actions. Again, referral cards, what we call success stories or patient results forms, phone calls, emails, letters, blogs, videos, all of those things are promotional actions. But those are all things that I need my staff doing to help me to be more profitable as an owner. So each staff member is tracking this over the course of the week. They're tracking how many visits did I see. They know that they need to see 65. How many YPRs did I get? How many referral cards did I get? How many online reviews did I get, et cetera? So we will give them a different target or quota that they will fill in that quota section every week. So for example, if we need a lot more new patients, then everybody's quota is going to be way up. If we don't need as many, it'll just be the standard. But we assign this quota to them in the weekly staff meeting every week so that they have this target, this quota that they're working for and then they're tracking how are they actually doing in terms of achieving it. Now, I'll tell you guys how you can get a copy of this as well as any other stat sheet that we use for any other position at the end. I'm happy to share these things with you guys. But this would just be an example of how we are actually tracking and having our staff track how efficient are they, how much quote unquote work are they actually getting done. Because again, the more efficient they are, the more promotion they get out, the more profitable we're going to be in the end as a practice, meaning that I can give them a raise, give them a bonus, whatever it might be, as the time comes along. And one of the things I found before I did this Power Team Builder course with Measurable Solutions was that I had not a good understanding of how many patient visits my staff really should be seeing. And we didn't have my staff and myself didn't have the same understanding, the same agreement. So for example, as you can see on this target sheet, a therapist should be seeing 65 visits a week for me and still doing all of these marketing and promoting things. And what I realized before I did this course, or as I was doing this course, was that my staff were actually seeing 55 or 56 visits a week and telling me that they were busy and too busy and they needed time in their schedule to do these things. Because as we got into it and really started looking at it, I was losing profit. I was losing profitability by all these empty spaces in the schedule that I hadn't really taught my staff how to use properly. So unless, number one, my therapist has 65 visits completely booked and being seen, not canceling, but being seen, and telling me that they can't get these things done, I'm not giving them any extra time. Now for the therapist, so 65 would be still some empty spaces. For the therapist that's got 70 or 72 visits seen, not booked but didn't show up, but seen, that's the person that, okay, in order for them to get these things done, I now realize I need to give them a little bit of extra time. So I will build in 45 minutes worth of time into a therapist schedule that's actually hitting this 65 visit mark, but anything less than that, that time is not built in. There are actually 53 things that can contribute to an empty schedule or cause you to be less profitable, et cetera. Self-discharges and drop-offs are a big part of that. And so when we don't have systems in place that ensure that a patient continues therapy as long as they need to continue, what you end up with is that staff member, that therapist, using their brain and going, oh, the patient said they were doing fine. They wanted to try not being in therapy for a while, and they wanted to try doing exercises on their own until they went to see the doctor. And so we agreed that they would go see the doctor, and if they needed anything after that, they'd call us back. Well, what that therapist has done is they've given up control, and they've allowed that patient to self-discharge. They've allowed that patient to drop off, because the therapist didn't have the right tools and the right system to follow to keep that patient and handle basically what I call an objection. So one of the things I learned again in this Power Team Builder course is not only what are these 53 things, but how do I help that therapist to be a better therapist and keep that patient the whole time? What questions should that therapist be asking? So as an example, because it's one of the areas that contributes to that is self-discharges and drop-offs, is at every visit for us, a therapist is asking the patient not only how are they doing. I think if you guys were to listen to your therapist, you're probably going to hear them ask the question, how are you doing today? And the patient's going to say, oh, I'm doing pretty good. Now, to the therapist, that means they're getting better. Good, that's what I want to hear. But they're still having problems with their joint mobility and their strength and if it's a shoulder, their scapular stability, let's say. But what the patient just said was, I'm actually doing pretty good. I'm not sure why I'm still coming, and especially paying this $40 copay. I think I'm going to stop. Now, the patient may go that far as to say, hey, why don't we hold and let's see what the doctor said. Or they may just not come back. But either way, that's a self-discharge and a drop-off, which causes significant problems with profitability and maintaining a good income level for our practice. But if my therapist is able to go, so tell me what good means, almost like they're talking to their teenager, then all of a sudden they get a lot more data. And at the same time, the therapist being trained in how do they have a conversation to help the patient to see what is still needed, why they still need to come to therapy. That helps to bring a lot of these 53 things under control, because you're right, we can end up seeing a big decrease in how long or how many visits somebody is seen for just because we don't have a good system in place. Because 30 to 35% of a physical therapy private practice income is lost due to these 5 major areas. It's lost due to empty spaces in the schedule, cancellations and no-shows, patients who discharge themselves early, patients who are seen less frequently than they should be, and not having a steady flow of new patients into the practice. So what do I mean by empty spaces in the schedule? Well, if we don't have a good system for how we schedule patients, meaning we bring the patient up front, we sit in the front office, says to them, when would you like to come? Well, the patient's going to go, well, I only want to come on Fridays at 5 o'clock. And if I don't have Fridays at 5 o'clock, now that patient doesn't get scheduled. As opposed to if my front office staff are trained in how to ask the same question, it would be, so I have Tuesdays and Thursdays at either 1, 3, or 5. Which one of those appointments works best for you? Now they're in control. Now we get that patient scheduled. And so if we're able to have systems in place and understand how to talk to people, which again is something that I learned in this Power Team Builder course, I can take this staff member, I'm going to go back to this, who might be a 6 or a 7, but I give them the right questions to ask, and all of a sudden they become a 2 or a 3 in terms of how efficient they are, how effective they are, how beneficial they are to the practice, and they start being able to control these areas where we lose a good deal of our income. Another one that I hear quite a bit from practice owners that I talk to is patients who are seen less frequently than they should be. So for example, if a therapist is doing an evaluation and the patient says, I'm really worried right now about the COVID numbers in our area, how about I just come once a week, give me a lot of exercises to do, and I'll do them at home. I promise you I'll be really good with them. If my therapist doesn't know how to create value for coming in that second time of the week, they're going to be a lot less valuable to me as an employee. And so I need to help them a little bit with that. And so again, recognizing that these are just 5 of the 53 areas, but these are 5 of the biggest areas that if we don't have a good system in place, we could actually be struggling as a practice. We get this eval that comes in, let's say, like you said, for 2 times a week for 6 weeks, but they only come for 3 or 4 visits because they discharge themselves early, or they only come 1 time a week because my staff member didn't know how to handle whatever the objection was, et cetera. And then we don't get them to replace themselves by asking for referrals. Man, we're spending a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of money and losing a lot of money at the same time, and it's going to really affect our profitability. So for example, using that as an example, if a patient shows up and says, I think today is going to be my last day, I'm feeling pretty good, I've got the exercises to do at home, and let's say they had 4 visits left, the question that my staff member is going to ask them is, so what is it that makes you think that you're ready to be on your own? And the answer, let's say, I'm just kind of making this up as we go, but the answer would be, well, I've got these exercises that you taught me and they're working really well. Look at how much better I am. Well, at that point, the therapist has to know, what was the patient's problem? What was the patient's goal? Let's say it was that I wanted to be able to throw a baseball with my son. Well, have you tried throwing a baseball with your son? No, I haven't tried that yet, but I was going to wait for a couple of weeks. I'll keep doing these exercises and then I'll give it a try. And if it's a problem, I'll come back. I love you guys. But again, my therapist can't give up there. They have to keep going. What is it that you think about these exercises that's going to get you the rest of the way there? That's where the patient's going to not have an answer. And that's the button, the point where, as a therapist, we need to educate that patient more. And so again, you're right, Naomi, it is just about making sure that they know what questions to ask, et cetera, to get them through that process. Because again, if we can control these 5 things, think about how much more profitable we would be, or at least how much less of an effect that 9% Medicare reduction would have on us. So if you guys don't know already, I want you to have an idea of what your average reimbursement would be per visit, because I want to put a dollar, I want you to be able to put a dollar figure on what every empty space, what every cancellation, what every patient who discharges themselves early, what coming 1 time a week, whatever it might be. I want you to be able to put a dollar figure on that. So basically, I'll just give you an example. I just took 4 of my insurances, but what I usually tell practice is take the top 6 or 7 insurances that you have, figure out what the average reimbursement is. I recognize that it's going to be different based on what we do, but you pretty much know that United Healthcare pays me an average of about $61.90. Aetna, I get 70. Medicare, I get this. Blue Cross, I get this, et cetera. And if I average that together, and these are just numbers that I made up, but if I average this together, I would know in this example that my average reimbursement is $84.40. So I know on a weekly basis, I know that my average reimbursement in my clinic for my 7 top insurances, payer sources, private pay is one of those 7, my average reimbursement is $78.32. So when I have a patient that stops coming halfway through therapy, I know I'm losing 6 times $78.32. If they don't replace themselves, I know I'm losing 12 visits times a new patient at $78.32. But I want you guys to have an idea of what your lost income would be, and so you can figure out what that average reimbursement is per visit. Because that's what really helps us to start to put a defining moment, or at least for me was a defining moment, that I really needed to spend some time practicing and training and drilling with my staff. That, for example, if I have that therapist, Naomi, that we were touching on, that doesn't know how to ask those questions or doesn't know what questions to ask, if I spend an hour over the course of the week training and drilling with this therapist, let's say they're a really well-paid therapist and they're making $45 an hour. Okay, that cost me $45 an hour. But if I can recapture even just 1 visit because of what we did, all of a sudden I made money instead of losing money. So if I build in, whether I have to pre-schedule it or I just use it because a patient canceled or it was an empty spot, and I build in time to start practicing and training, this for me is one of the biggest things that's been successful. Is I have to recognize I give them money to go to CEU courses all year long to learn how to be a better hands-on therapist, but I have to give them the skills also with dealing with people. And so I have to make that investment in that as well. And so when I recognized how much money I was losing, all of a sudden spending an hour a week, not so big of a deal anymore. Even if it meant I had to schedule it into their schedule, sure, I lost 1 or 2 visits for a week or 2 to get them better trained. All of a sudden it was way more profitable and way more of a better outcome for me, because I don't really like burning money and losing cash. And I want to make sure that I'm really know what's going on. So the stats that I would say at a minimum a practice should be tracking on the whole practice as well as on each individual clinician is what's the number of new patient visits? What's the number of new patients that come as a result of that clinician doing the actions that we've talked about? What are we collecting weekly as a group? And I always say when you're going to start tracking metrics, track them on the whole practice. don't worry about tracking them on each person individually initially. So what are we collecting on a weekly basis? What is our average collected per visit? So that's that stat that we just talked about. What is our average expense per visit? So it's great for me to know that I collect $78.32 on average on a visit, but if I don't know what it costs me, well, then I have no idea how am I really doing. Another statistic I say to track is what's called your arrival rate. So how many patients were scheduled versus how many actually showed up. It's a little bit different than your cancellation rate. Again, I'm happy to talk to you guys individually and explain that. And then, like I said earlier, your average length of stay is definitely a statistic that you should be tracking as well. So at a minimum, these are some statistics or metrics that we really want to be tracking because they're going to give us a good idea of how profitable our practice is. It's going to tell us whether or not we've got a good heartbeat or we've got one that's basically getting ready to flatline. Because again, if I'm collecting $78.32 a visit, but it costs me $78 a visit to deliver every care, I've got a very small profit margin. I can't live off of 32 cents, regardless of how many patients I'm seeing. And so knowing what my profit margin is very important. Now, these are three categories that the Small Business Administration set out. And they basically have said that a practice that's got a profit margin of 10% or less is what they would classify as a struggling business. So that's a practice that's going to have a difficult time giving pay raises to staff, handling an increase in rent, buying new equipment, having any money left over for you as the owner. And so again, think about it. If you've got a 10% profit margin and Medicare takes 9% of that away, all of a sudden things aren't so good anymore. Then the next category is anything between 10% and 15%. They say that this is a business that's okay until a problem comes along. So whether it's another COVID or it's Medicare reducing their rates, et cetera, what if a staff member suddenly leaves or can't come to work for a long period of time? Seasonal changes, things along that lines. So what we're really shooting for is a practice that's got a 20% or better profit margin, that it's solid, it's doing well. They're able to grow, they're able to pay their staff, give their staff raises, give them a reward for getting a lot of referrals or for getting good outcomes or whatever it might be. And this is really where, as the owner, we start to have the ability to take that extra profit that we deserve to have as a business owner, hire more staff, not have to wait until the very last minute to hire people, et cetera, and kind of help us to always be constantly growing. And so the last concept I really want to touch on is how many visits does your clinic need to see? Well, the question is, obviously it needs enough to pay the bills. But what I want you to look at is take your average expenses. And again, I'm happy to get with you guys individually and walk you through this a little bit more, but take your average expenses over the last 6 months, figure out the average per month, divide that by 4.3 because there's basically 4.3 weeks in a month. You're going to add in an extra 15% for your extras, just things that haven't been accounted for. You're going to figure out what your average reimbursement is per visit. And you're going to basically come out with, for example, I just used these numbers. If this on the right-hand side, number one, if the clinic is collecting over the last 6 months, if their expenses over the last 6 months are $157,000, their average weekly expense is just over $6,000. Now I'm going to add in that extra 15%, it's almost like a reserve fund, a just in case fund. And then I know that the average reimbursement that I used here was $84.40. I divide those two numbers. For that clinic to be profitable, to be in that profit margin of 20%, they need to be seeing 83 visits per week. So again, it's a simple way for you to have an idea of how is your practice really measuring up? How profitable is it really? Because again, I don't want you to be collecting $78.32 and it costs you $78 and all that you've got left over is this measly 32 cents that, in a sense, the government doesn't even really recognize change anymore. So we need to have a much bigger profit margin. This gives you an idea of what is that profit margin, and then you can figure out where are we really falling into on this 10, 15, or 20%. Because we can't just have enough money in the bank account to pay the bills this week. We have to actually have money left over. And so if we don't have extra visits to save that extra money, how will we survive when Medicare cuts fees, et cetera? And so again, these are things that I've learned in a course called the Power Team Builder, as well as in a course that I took with Measurable Solutions called the Practice Profit Builder. And so they're skills, they're things that teach you the organizational structure or the systems to put in place to organize the practice to not only get your staff working well together, so that you can have staff hitting their targets. This is a graph of staff that are hitting their targets out of my practice, right? So with the exception of 1 week in the last 13 weeks, we've had staff members, and we're adding staff every week that are hitting their targets, that are getting the outcomes that we want them to get. And these are all things that, again, I learned through these 2 courses. How do I put these systems into place so that I have, even during this year with COVID, my practice has grown 22%. I have a profit margin of 26%. I didn't need to rely on the PPP loan. I had money in reserves, et cetera. And so I have an organizational structure that I've really learned from these 2 courses. And that's really what I want for you guys. This is an example of somebody who did the Practice Profit Builder course, not me, another client. And this is an example of how profitable they have been week after week after week. So 2 weeks after taking the course, their profit margin went up over last year, and it's continued to do so. They're actually more profitable this year despite COVID than they were last year, having done that course. And that's really what I want for you guys, is to be able to be prepared. This is an example of a practice that, so there's an analysis that you can do on your practice. This is an example of a practice that is not very prepared for the looming changes in Medicare reimbursement. And by the way, whatever Medicare does, every other insurance is going to do at some point in time. So this is a practice that doesn't have good infrastructure, that doesn't have good marketing systems in place, that doesn't have a quality assurance, et cetera. And they're not going to do very well in the changing times. Versus this is an analysis of a different practice that's much more prepared. They have good systems, they have some marketing, they have some organization, they have good delivery of care. Their length of stay is where it should be. Their cancellations are very low because they've got systems in place. And that's really what I want for you guys.